On Friday, while Trump was saying maybe no deal is better and the White House was telling Congress the war is over, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was on the phone. 7 phone calls in one day to Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and the European Union's foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas. 7 countries, one day. While the White House said the war was over, a country that has accepted that the war is over does not make 7 diplomatic calls in one day, briefing regional partners on its latest negotiating initiatives. A country that has accepted defeat does not coordinate with the EU's top diplomat about long-term security arrangements and reopening Hormuz. A country in collapse does not call Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Egypt in the same afternoon to brief them on a position. Iran is not accepting the White House's characterization of the situation. And what Iran said this week in public through its armed forces spokesperson is the most explicit statement of intent made by any Iranian official since the ceasefire began. A senior Iranian security source quoted by English-language state media Press TV said the U.S. naval blockade will soon be met with practical and unprecedented action. The source added that Iran's armed forces have shown restraint in order to give diplomacy a chance and provide Trump with an opportunity to end the war. But the source said Iran's armed forces believe that patience has limits and that a punishing response is necessary if the blockade continues. Practical, unprecedented, punishing. 3 words, all in one statement. From a senior Iranian security source, not a politician, not a propagandist, from the armed forces, from the people who make operational decisions in the Strait. Watch this. I want to spend today explaining exactly what Iran's 7 cold day actually means diplomatically, what practical and unprecedented action could mean in military terms, why the White House's hostilities terminated letter and Trump's maybe no deal statement are the 2 pieces of an argument that Iran is publicly rejecting on every available channel, and what the gap between the war is over and practical and unprecedented action tells you about where this conflict is actually heading. Let me start with the 7 calls, because they are not random diplomatic activity. They are a specific diplomatic strategy being executed with unusual urgency. Araghchi called Turkey's Hakan Fidan. He called Egypt's Badr Abdelati. He called Qatar's Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani. He called Saudi Arabia's Prince Faisal bin Farhan. He called Iraq's Fuad Hussein. He called Azerbaijan's Ceyhun Bayramov. And he called the EU's Kaja Kallas. Now look at who is on that list and what each country represents strategically. Turkey is a NATO member with strong ties to both the US and the Muslim world, and has maintained diplomatic relations with Iran throughout the war. It sits at the crossroads of European and Middle Eastern interests and has been a consistent mediating presence. Egypt is the Arab world's most populous country and the home of the Arab League, making any regional security architecture unworkable without Cairo's participation. Qatar hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the U.S. military's largest installation in the Middle East, home to forward-deployed U.S. Air Force assets that were part of Operation Epic Fury. Qatar is simultaneously Iran's neighbor, America's military host, and the country whose royal family has maintained active back-channel relationships with Tehran for years. Saudi Arabia is OPEC's dominant producer, the country whose Aramco exports define global oil supply, and the country whose relationship with Iran has oscillated between hostility and rapprochement since the 2016 execution of Shia cleric Nimr al-Nimr. Iraq shares a 1,300-kilometer border with Iran and is the country where Iranian and American strategic interests have been in daily tension since 2003. Azerbaijan sits on Iran's northwestern border and is the country through which any northern land corridor for Iranian trade would need to pass. And significantly, Azerbaijan has its own relationship with both Russia and Turkey that makes it a potential conduit for diplomatic communication. And Kaja Kallas is the EU's foreign policy chief, the person who coordinates European positions and represents the collective economic interests of the world's largest single market. 7 specific countries, not chosen randomly. Chosen because each one represents a different dimension of the pressure or the solution or the witness record that Iran is building. Araghchi called each of these people on Friday personally, and after each call, he posted on X to say the call happened. He is creating a public record. Every country on that list now has a documented communication with Iran's foreign minister on the day the White House declared the war over. If Iran takes unprecedented action next week, those 7 countries will have been briefed that Iran was still pursuing diplomacy right up to that moment. The record matters. It is the evidence trail that separates an aggressive act from a defensive response. Now, let me explain what practical and unprecedented action could mean, because this phrase has been used in Iranian communications before, and it has a specific register that differs from political rhetoric. When Iranian officials say unprecedented, they are describing something that has not been done in this specific conflict. Not unprecedented in human history, unprecedented in the sequence of this particular war. There are 3 specific options that have been named explicitly by Iranian officials in the past 2 weeks and that have not yet been activated. The first is the Bab el-Mandeb. Borujerdi named it Wednesday. Ghalibaf put it in his equation on April 26th. Velayati confirmed the unified command framework for it on Sunday. The Houthis demonstrated from 2023 to 2025 that they can close the Red Sea corridor to non-approved shipping. That closure lasted 14 months during the Gaza war and cost the global economy tens of billions of dollars. It has not been ordered yet in this war. It is the unplayed card. Practical and unprecedented would be playing it. The second is Kharg Island infrastructure. Iran's Kharg terminal handles approximately 90% of Iran's oil exports. If the blockade prevents tankers from taking cargo from Kharg, the storage tanks fill. When they fill, the oil backs up into the pipeline network. When the pipeline network reaches capacity, the wells face overpressurization. This is the scenario Trump described when he said the line explodes from within. Iran has been managing this risk by throttling production, producing less oil to reduce the pressure buildup. But this management has a limit. If the blockade continues and storage capacity approaches maximum, Iran faces a binary choice: shut in the wells, taking potentially permanent production damage, or take action to reopen the waterway so oil can flow again. Practical and unprecedented in this context means Iran preferring the second option. The third is the pipeline infrastructure of Iran's Gulf neighbors. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, and other Gulf energy infrastructure that bypasses Hormuz are all within range of Iranian missiles and drones. Iran struck Saudi Aramco facilities at Abqaiq in 2019, temporarily cutting Saudi Arabia's oil output by 5% of global supply. Iran has done this before. Unprecedented in this war would be doing it again, targeting the bypass infrastructure that Gulf states are using to partially replace Hormuz-dependent exports. Iran has not done any of those 3 things. Practical and unprecedented is Iran's armed forces saying, "We have options we have not used. The blockade is the reason we have not used them. The blockade continuing is the condition that removes our restraint. Watch this." Now let me explain the White House letter and what Iran's 7 calls tell you about Iran's reception of it. The White House sent a formal notification to Congress on Friday stating that the hostilities that began on February 28, 2026 have terminated. This letter fulfills the War Powers Resolution's reporting requirement while simultaneously arguing that the resolution's 60-day clock has already expired because the war is over. The logic is, war started February 28th, ceasefire declared April 7th, no exchange of fire since April 7th, therefore hostilities terminated, therefore the clock stopped at April 7th, therefore no new authorization is required. Iran's response to this letter is the 7 phone calls, not a formal diplomatic protest to the United Nations, not a statement from the Foreign Ministry rejecting the American characterization. 7 phone calls. In English language media, with posts on X, briefing regional partners on Iran's latest initiatives to end the conflict that the White House says is already over. This is Iran saying, if the war is over, why are you still running a blockade? If hostilities have terminated, why is Brent at 125? If the war is over, why is an Iranian security source saying patience has limits and a punishing response is necessary? The White House letter is legally designed to resolve the domestic American constitutional crisis over war powers. It is not designed to describe the operational reality in the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran's response, 7 calls, not 1 statement, is Iran demonstrating that the operational reality has not changed while refusing to legitimize the legal fiction that the war is over. Now, let me explain Trump's maybe no deal statement in the context of Iran's response. Trump said, and frankly, maybe we're better off not making a deal at all. Do you want to know the truth? Because we can't let this thing go on. Been going on too long. This statement is simultaneously honest and strategic. It is honest because Trump genuinely does not know if a deal is possible on terms America can accept. He said Iran's leadership is very disjointed, 2 to 3 groups, maybe 4, and he is not sure they can ever get there. He said Iran has made strides, which is an acknowledgement that the revised proposals have moved, but not enough. He is describing a real negotiating stalemate. It is strategic because been going on too long and maybe no deal at all are signals. To Iran, we are considering not needing a deal. To the American public, I am losing patience and willing to end this. To Republican senators who want an AUMF, I am not committed to indefinite continuation. To markets, the uncertainty is deliberate, not accidental. But here is what Trump's statement means in the context of Iran's 7 calls. Araghchi was on the phone all day Friday to partners who could help broker or witness a deal. He called the EU. He called Saudi Arabia. He called Qatar. He called Turkey. He was building the diplomatic architecture for a deal at the exact moment Trump was publicly questioning whether a deal is even desirable. That parallel activity tells you that Iran has not given up on the diplomatic track. Iran's armed forces are saying practical and unprecedented action is coming. Iran's foreign minister is on the phone with 7 partners in one day. Both things are happening simultaneously. The threat and the diplomacy coexist, which is the classic posture of a negotiating party that has leverage it is prepared to use but prefers not to use. The el-Mandeb is the leverage. Closing it would add 12% of global trade to the existing disruption, pushing oil to levels that Goldman Sachs has said could reach $200 per barrel. At $200 oil, the American political pressure becomes unbearable. The 61% who say the Iran war was a mistake in Friday's Washington Post poll would become a much larger number. And the 48% who say make a deal even if it's worse for America becomes a much larger number too. Iran is holding that card. The armed forces are publicly saying patience has limits. The foreign minister is calling every regional partner who could help deliver a deal before that card is played. Watch, this is not rhetoric. It is a specific timetable being communicated through every available channel simultaneously. Now let me steelman Trump's position, because he is not wrong about everything he said on Friday. Trump is right that Iran's leadership has a genuine consensus problem. The revised proposal Iran submitted was rejected as insufficient. The original proposal was also rejected. Each time Iran revises upward, Trump says not enough. But the direction of movement, Iran submitting proposals at all, Iran revising proposals, Iran's foreign minister making 7 calls in one day, represents real movement from where Iran was on February 28th, when its position was no negotiations under attack. That movement is a product of real pressure. Trump is also right that been going on too long is true for Iran as well as for America. Iran's internet has been blacked out for 63 days. 3,400 Iranians have been killed. The economy is under severe stress. 2 million people have been thrown out of work. Inflation at 67% is destroying household purchasing power. Iran's leadership may be unified at the top in its public messaging, but 63 days of war and economic strangulation produces real internal pressure on any government. And Trump is right that the specific demand, no nuclear weapons, which means at this moment there will never be a deal unless they agree that there will never be nuclear weapons, is a demand that Iran could technically satisfy without surrendering its enrichment program entirely. No nuclear weapons is not the same as no enrichment. Japan enriches uranium without having nuclear weapons. Germany participates in the enrichment consortium without having weapons. Brazil enriches. Netherlands enriches. The specific commitment Trump says he needs is not inherently incompatible with Iran retaining a civilian nuclear program if the verification and enforcement mechanisms are credible and durable enough to satisfy American concerns about a sprint toward weaponization. Trump has also been more specific about the timeline question than his critics acknowledge. He said in the Axios interview that Iran wants a 25-year deal. He rejected it. He said Iran has come a long way. He said, the question is whether they will go far enough. He is describing a negotiation that has real movement, real positions, and a real gap that is narrowing even if it is not closed. His maybe no deal statement is a negotiating position, not a policy declaration. Here is where the Steelman collapses. Iran's interpretation of no nuclear weapons is different from Trump's interpretation in a specific way that the JCPOA made visible. Iran says its nuclear program is for civilian purposes and it has never sought weapons. The JCPOA was the mechanism for verifying that claim. It included inspections, centrifuge limits, stockpile limits, and a monitoring regime run by the IAEA. The IAEA certified Iran's compliance with every provision of the JCPOA at the time of the American exit in 2018. Iran was not building a weapon. Iran had complied, and America walked away anyway. So, when Trump says there will never be a deal unless Iran agrees there will never be nuclear weapons, and when he says he needs Iran to cry uncle, Iran hears this. Even if we comply with every provision, as we did with the JCPOA, a future American president can exit the agreement. The compliance did not protect us. The 2018 exit proved that American guarantees are not durable beyond the presidency that made them. That is why Araghchi is not just negotiating terms with America. He is calling Kallas and Qatar and Turkey and Saudi Arabia. He is building the architecture of guarantees that do not depend solely on American commitment. A deal co-signed by the EU and endorsed by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and witnessed by Turkey has more durability than a bilateral Iran-America agreement. A deal with Russian custody of uranium and Chinese guarantorship is harder to walk away from unilaterally than the JCPOA was. Iran is not trying to get a better deal from America. Iran is trying to get a deal that survives America's tendency to exit deals it made. The 7 calls on Friday are not evidence of Iranian desperation. They are evidence of Iranian diplomatic sophistication, building the witness network before the deal is made, creating the international stakeholder framework that makes unilateral American exit harder, calling Saudi Arabia and Qatar so that the Gulf states have a stake in the agreement's stability, calling the EU so that European economic interests are aligned with the deal's durability, calling Turkey so that a NATO member is invested in the outcome, calling Qatar so that the country hosting America's largest forward military base in the region has a diplomatic stake in how this ends, and calling Azerbaijan. That one deserves a specific explanation. Azerbaijan shares a border with Iran in the northwest. It has an airport at Zangilan near the Iranian border that was rebuilt after the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war and is capable of handling cargo flights. Azerbaijan maintains relationships with both Russia and Iran and with the West. If any future land-based delivery system for Iran, either imports or exports, is going to work as a supplement to Pakistani land routes, Azerbaijan is one of the possible corridors. Araghchi calling Azerbaijan on Friday may be part of laying the groundwork for that corridor, while simultaneously signaling to Russia, which borders Azerbaijan, that Iran's diplomatic engagement is multi-directional. The Bab el-Mandeb is the leverage. The 7 phone calls are the diplomacy, and they are happening simultaneously because Iran's position is not either or. Iran is maintaining the threat and the diplomacy at the same time. The threat is that if the blockade continues, practical and unprecedented action follows. The diplomacy is that Iran is willing to reach an agreement that resolves the conflict before that action becomes necessary. Both messages were delivered on the same Friday by different Iranian officials through different channels to different audiences. The armed forces spokesperson spoke to Press TV. Araghchi posted on X about his calls. Both statements were public, both were made on Friday, and both were heard by the 7 countries that now have a stake in what happens next. Goldman Sachs raised its fourth quarter 2026 Brent forecast to $90 from $80. That revision tells institutional investors to price a longer disruption. But Goldman's forecast is built on the assumption that the Bab el-Mandeb stays unactivated and the conflict stays in its current configuration. If the Houthis move, if the unplayed card gets played, Goldman's model breaks in real time. The market reprices within hours of any Bab el-Mandeb development. And the repricing would go to numbers that make 125 look nostalgic. Iran knows this. Iran's armed forces know this. The 7 countries Araghchi called know this. And Trump, who got a CENTCOM briefing on military options Thursday night and said, on a human basis, he prefers not to blast them, knows this too. Watch this. Here is what I want you to watch specifically in the coming days. Kallas's call with Araghchi about long-term security arrangements is the most underreported development of the week. The EU's foreign policy chief discussing security architecture for Hormuz directly with Iran while America's blockade is running represents European diplomatic engagement that bypasses American policy. If Kallas issues any public statement about the content of those discussions, or if the EU makes any formal proposal about Hormuz governance, that is a signal that Europe has decided to pursue a parallel track to whatever the US-Iran negotiating process produces. Watch Pakistan's land routes. 6 overland corridors opened April 25th under the Transit of Goods Order. If container traffic through those routes increases significantly in the next 2 weeks, Iran is absorbing the maritime blockade through a land alternative. The blockade's coercive power diminishes proportionally as land alternatives scale up. Watch whether any joint statement emerges from the 7 countries Araghchi called. If Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Turkey coordinate a position, Iran has successfully converted Friday's calls into a coalition. That coalition would have the standing and the relationships to propose a Hormuz framework that does not require Iran submission, and that America could accept as a multilateral outcome rather than a bilateral defeat. Watch the Bab el-Mandeb shipping data. Any change in Houthi naval positioning, drone activity near the strait, or communication intercepts from Yemen is the precursor signal to practical and unprecedented. The armed forces said patience has limits. The limits have a shape. Watch the shape, and watch what Trump says next. His Friday statement that on a human basis, he prefers not to blast them is the most honest thing he said all week. It tells you that the blast option is real but not preferred, that the maybe no deal statement was a negotiating message, not a policy declaration, and that the person making these decisions is still looking for the deal that lets him say, "Cry uncle was heard," even if that cry is quiet enough for Iran to describe it as something else. Trump said, maybe no deal. The White House said, the war is over. And Iran said, watch this. The 7 phone calls were Iran's answer to both. If you found this useful, push back on it in the comments. I will see you in the next one.